Good morning and welcome to the Sunrise Podcast. My name is Erica Kenny and I'm so glad that you are listening. We are now in our fourth edition and I am so happy to say that this will also be a video podcast. Thank you all so much for your love and support you gave to my first video podcast 2 weeks ago. Even though I'm a noob at editing and recording, I'm so happy to see that you all enjoyed it. For today's topic, we will be covering a very political question. It is a subject that every politician loves to talk about and blame the other party for. Some say that this question can change elections and even topple governments. Why are prices so high? Seriously, many say that people vote first and foremost with their wallets, and those wallets have never seemed lighter. Yes, prices are on the mend where I am, but prices for everything from groceries to refrigerators seem to be up. COVID is the root cause of this all, of course, but that's not enough of an answer for me. I love to ask why, after all. So today we'll be diving right into the nitty-gritty of what's causing the cost of living to skyrocket. The first thing we'll have to deal with is inflation. In its most basic terms, inflation refers to the gradual lowering of a country's purchasing power over time. This leads to the price of both goods and services to go up. One easily understood example of this is how things used to be back in the day. 100 years ago, you could get a candy bar for just a penny, but right now a penny can get you basically nothing. Even though it's often used as a political buzzword, inflation shouldn't be considered a bad thing for a country or an economy. Experts consider a 2% inflation rate a sign of a healthy economy because it can stimulate spending and economic growth. If you know that the money you've stuffed under the mattress is going to be worth 2% less the next year, you're more likely to invest in the stock market or in businesses. This can become a problem if it surpasses wage growth. This can lead to an increase in poverty. When we want to measure inflation, experts pick out a group of items and measure the change in their prices month by month to get monthly inflation or year by year to get annual inflation. In the United States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics measures inflation and puts the numbers in their Consumer Price Index. Another measure of inflation in the United States is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, PCE, which measures a broad range of items in the CPI, like healthcare. Since the pandemic, inflation has risen to 7%, which is far above the 2% necessary for a healthy economy. And this number is just the average for all items. The inflation rate for food has gone up 5.4% since the pandemic began. These numbers are the highest they've ever been in the United States since 1982. This is a 40-year high. High inflation can lead to businesses raising prices, so it's a good idea for us to go over the root cause of inflation. The first topic that should be covered are supply chain issues. You may think that with things opening back up, the supply chains that keep our global economy running should bounce back in full, right? Well, that's not exactly the case. During the start of the pandemic, things practically shut down. With people stuck in their homes and unable to buy things, many retailers realized that they wouldn't be able to sell their goods, so they liquidated their inventories and fired or laid off workers. This happened in the transportation and shipping industries as well. Less people and businesses buying things meant that there was little need for dock workers or truckers, and so these people lost their jobs. The problem comes in when you consider that it's harder for businesses to bounce back than it is for individuals. While you as a person can simply leave your house and go to the store, it's hard for the businesses that you may go to just open up just like that. Workers that were laid off need to be rehired, new workers need to be found and trained. Inventories that were trimmed for the lockdown need to be re-upped and purchased to meet new demand. This means that new dock workers need to be hired to bring ports back up to full capacity, and truckers need to be contracted again to ship goods across the country. Basically, during the pandemic, supply chain shrunk itself, and it's having trouble growing again. I'm sure that eventually we will get back up to the pre-pandemic supply chain, but this won't happen overnight. In the meantime, stores have to deal with the very low inventories and being short-staffed. Because the cost can be split between all of the items, economies of scale dictate that it costs less to ship items the more items there are. This means that businesses are paying more to get the few items that they're able to reach them. This, of course, leads to rising prices. The other side of the supply chain coin is demand. It's helpful now to look at the concept of demand pull inflation. It states that when demand for goods and services rises faster than supply of those goods and services, the prices will rise. This is exactly what is happening right now. After not buying as many things that they wanted due to the pandemic, many consumers are now competing for the limited amounts of goods that businesses are able to provide for them. Back to the supply chain side for a moment here. The distributions aren't just affecting individual items like shoes and TVs. The most insidious part of how tight our supply chains have become is how they can impact production costs. The rising costs of fertilizer and feed crops have led to a rise in agricultural costs by 18%, which can directly correlate to a rise in prices at the grocery store. Labor is another factor in this. Most high production farms are staffed by migrant workers who may have been disabled, killed, or even prevented from entering the country due to COVID-19. Speaking of food, the war in Ukraine has led to an increase in prices. Ukraine produces a significant fraction of the world's corn and wheat, which are the building blocks for many breads, cereals, and processed foods. Since the war has cut off, a lot of ports' crucial grain supplies have been cut off, leaving the price of grain to skyrocket. One thing that is often talked about when thinking about the recent rise in prices is the stimulus checks. There were 3 rounds of direct stimulus aid to Americans between 2020 and 2021, and many cite this as increasing inflation by flooding the economy with more money and leaving people to compete even more for the limited amounts of goods and services. Inflation is not just a static thing, however. It is constantly shifting, and the government is always trying to conserve it. It's always trying to control it. In the United States, the main body that tries to control inflation is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 by the Federal Reserve Act, making the agency 109 years old. Before the Fed, as it's commonly called, was created, there was no system in place to regulate the day-to-day operations of the United States economy or even secure banks. Over the years, the responsibilities and goals of the Fed have grown. Today, it is responsible for making monetary policy, ensuring price stability, and boosting employment. The Fed reports to Congress twice a year on its policy goals. Basically, the Fed is a supervisor of the entire United States economy. The power of the Fed that is most crucial to our conversation today is their control of interest rates. To understand the Fed's interest rates, we need to understand why the Fed is charging interest in the first place. All banks in the United States are required to keep a certain percentage of customer deposits on hand as reserves. These reserves are kept in the Fed's vaults, and the Fed makes sure that at the end of each and every day, the banks have the required amount of reserves. This is one of the Federal Reserve's core duties, as it prevents mass bank failures due to mass withdrawals, like what happened during the Wall Street crash of the Great Depression. Banks can lend out and invest money as long as can lend out or invest as much money as they want as long as they have the required amount of reserves. Banks don't want to have too much money lying around, though. Money left in the Fed's coffers isn't being lent out to businesses or invested in the stock market, so even with its target 2% inflation rate, it is losing value. The Fed doesn't want excess money either. To keep the economy strong, they want as much money flowing and being used to generate value as possible. So each bank is incentivized to only keep around the bare minimum amount of money that they need. At the end of each day, each bank knows how much money it has on hand, and it knows how much money it needs. Before the Fed does its daily check, each bank wants those numbers to match. But how do they do this? By giving out their excess money to other banks, of course. If a bank knows that it won't have enough money at the end of each day to reach its reserve requirements, it can ask another bank that might have more money than it needs to lend it some money. Since the second bank really wants to limit the amount of excess reserves it has, it agrees to lend the first bank some money, with interest, of course. This is where the Federal Reserve's interest rates comes in. The Federal Reserve can raise or lower this interest rate 8 times a year. A higher interest rate makes it more expensive for banks to borrow money, which can combat inflation, while a lower interest rate can fight deflation. This happens because banks are being charged higher interest rates. They will start charging you a higher interest rate as well. This raises the rates of new mortgages, credit cards, and personal loans. This pushes businesses to curb growth and raise prices, and it pushes consumers to spend less money. This can go a long way in limiting the competition for the small pool of goods. The Federal Reserve interest rates peaked around 20% in the 80s and was at an all-time low of almost 0% after the 2008 recession, and has recently climbed to a max of 4.5% as of December of 2022. Despite the fact that rising interest rates are meant to help the economy by limiting inflation, they may have the effect of making things more expensive. When it's more expensive for banks to borrow money, they raise prices. But raising prices produce inflation, and thus this keeps happening. Wages are another key factor in this whole inflation conversation. If the cost of an item goes up by 4%, that doesn't really matter if the amount you earn has also gone up by 4%. But is this happening? The simple answer would be yes. To attract more workers to fill the millions of empty positions across the country, many businesses are raising their hourly wages and offering more benefits, but that really doesn't tell the full picture. Real wage growth is a metric that measures the amount that workers get paid compared to the cost of goods, inflation basically. And real wage growth hasn't been growing at all. About 2/3 of people in the United States say that their pay hasn't kept pace with their rising cost of living. As of 2021, the wages rose around 4%, which sounds good until you remember that the inflation rate that year was 7%. That all sounds pretty grim, doesn't it? Everything's getting more expensive, and your pay isn't going to rise. It's especially more bleak when you realize that we may be headed into a recession in 2023, and that COVID is still killing hundreds of people every day. It's not like we can really do anything about this either. Your individual spending or monetary decisions won't fix global supply chains or make the Fed lower interest rates. The only thing that ordinary consumers can do in these circumstances is try to spend less and save more. It's a rather dark end to our broadcast today, but I want to thank you all for listening as always, and end off with some questions. Have you noticed prices going up? Is your income enough to cover your expenses? Are you upset that Dollar Tree, the store very famous for only charging $1 maximum for their products, is now charging $1.25 for most items, as I am? If you have answers to any of these questions or just want to talk about the economy, feel free to call, text, or email me anytime. This has been Erica Kenny with the Daily Sunrise Podcast, and I hope you all have an amazing day.